Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this dark and stormy November evening. My name is Jessica Plachta. I'm the Executive Director for Lynn Canal Conservation based in Haines, Alaska, here on the unceded traditional territories of the Jilkaat and Klukwan people. I'd like to begin by thanking our partners for co-planning this event, Takshunuk Watershed Council, Rivers Without Borders, and Southeast Alaska Conservation Council. I think we can all agree that it's really important that we as a community have all the information we need to make informed choices about our future. So we're very grateful to have mining expert James Kuipers joining us from Wisdom, Montana, and sharing his more than 35 years of expertise with us tonight. Please be advised that we will be recording the event and making it available on our websites. The agenda for the evening is pretty straightforward. We'll have a presentation by Jim Kuipers with questions following, so please feel free to share your questions in the chat box or be ready to raise your hand using the raise hand icon following the presentation. But first, Derek Poinsett is the Executive Director of the local science-focused Takshunuk Watershed Council. In brief, TWC monitors the health of our shared watershed and some key species and habitats, and they offer fun educational community programs like Marvin Gardens and Jilkaat Forest Investigators. Derek has a few words for us tonight. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to everybody for joining us and contributing some of your time to this topic. Over the past few years, the Takshunuk Watershed Council has sponsored a number of these educational events addressing mining and specifically the Palmer Project. They're always a collaborative effort, and I want to thank Lynn Canal Conservation, SEAC, and Rivers Without Borders as my co-sponsors here tonight. And putting together programs like this in the past, we've also worked with Chilkoot Indian Association, Chilkaat Indian Village, the Haines Borough, the Haines Chamber of Commerce, and also Constantine Mining, among others. The Takshunuk Watershed Council is an organization focused primarily on fish and the conservation of fisheries and habitats. And so some may ask, why are we involved in these community educational programs about mining? And why would we commission a mining industry consultant to do an analysis of the Palmer Project's economic prospects? Well, first, the health of the natural environment in the Jilkaat Valley is not separate from the health of the human community here, including its commercial health. Whether or not a large mining project succeeds or fails economically will have an impact not only on bank accounts and property values, but it will also affect water and fish, bears and eagles, and all the rest of the people in the valley also, even those not directly involved in the project itself. There is significant risk in developing a mine here, and quite often the most serious impacts to both humans and to the environment occur when the mining project fails after development, not when it succeeds. So let's say you want to go subsistence fishing out to Glacier Point. You show up at a launch ramp at the launch ramp in Letnikoff Cove, and it's choppy out there. There's even a little bit of whitewater, and you've just got a little 16-foot skiff. What do? How do you decide if going fishing, the promise of a gill net full of bright Jilkaat River sockeyes is worth the risk? Well, obviously, you would use a VHF radio or your phone to check the marine weather forecast, and maybe you'd also look at the conditions at Eldred Rock and at the Haines Airport. You would try and seek out the best and most accurate information you can possibly find to inform your actions and to mitigate or even eliminate any risk. And you would want that information to come from a source that does not care whether or not you go fishing or how many fish you catch. If the source of your information stands to either gain or lose by how you use that information, then that source is not reliable. And that's what we're trying to do here, and also in past efforts. We are trying to bring reliable, accurate, and precise information about this proposed mining project, not just for the residents of the Jilkaat Valley, but also for our government agencies, officials, and politicians, and others who are part of this discussion, because they too do not always have access to the best information. And so I thank you all for joining us here tonight. I hope you get something useful out of your time spent here. And I want to thank especially Chris Zimmer from Rivers Without Borders in Juneau for really being the one who worked with Jim to make the technical report and also tonight's presentation come together for all of us. Thank you. Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks again, Derek. CX Jilkaat Watershed organizer Shannon Donahue is in the wings tonight, but she's been very instrumental in helping plan this event, so thank you, Shannon. I'd also like to thank Rivers Without Borders for their essential transboundary conservation work, bringing a regional and international awareness to our shared efforts. Chris Zimmer is Rivers Without Borders Alaska campaign director. He's been campaigning for clean water in Alaska for 20 years. Chris is an avid fisherman as well, so he's got personal incentive to keep an eye on water quality and the mines that might impact healthy salmon runs here in Southeast Alaska. So thank you, Chris. And Chris is going to lead us into Jim Kuipers' presentation. So I'm going to ask everyone to maintain their mutes and maybe turn off their videos so that we don't have accidental pop-up videos happening during the presentation. So thank you so much. Take it away, Chris.
All right, thanks very much, Jessica. Again, this is Chris Zimmer. I'm the Alaska Campaign Director with Rivers Without Borders here in Juneau, and I'm going to introduce Jim Kuipers. Jim is the Principal Consulting Engineer with Kuipers and Associates in Wisdom, Montana. He's got an extensive background in mining, going back about 4 decades. He grew up in a mining family. He worked in the mines. Graduated with a BS in mineral processing from the Montana School of Mines, and he's worked in a number of positions with several different mining companies and several different mines. His work now is consulting and advising public interest groups, tribes, First Nations, governments, local communities about mining and environmental concerns. And one of his real expertise is to kind of translate the mining language, the very complex documents, into something we can understand, so we can actually tell, okay, what is this study telling us? What can we glean from it? What can we not? He's a registered PE, professional engineer, qualified person consistent with the mining guidelines, and has been qualified as an expert witness in a number of different court hearings. I've worked with Jim for a number of years. He's done several studies of these feasibility studies and preliminary economic analyses, because often there's a lot of promotion about those documents, and people will claim that they prove that money is to be made. But in fact, a lot of these documents are preliminary, very speculative, and we're going to ask Jim to tease out the truth in the Constantine preliminary economic analysis and some of their other documents. So I guess without more from me, I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Chris, and just want to thank you, Rivers Without Borders, and other folks for hiring me, as well as inviting me to give this webinar tonight. And I should mention to folks, I'm coming to you from a few miles outside of Wisdom, Montana. I think Chris mentioned that. And so I appreciate the chance and opportunity via this medium to do this with so many of you from Alaska and elsewhere that I see. So I'm going to share my screen. I'll try not to just read off the screen tonight. I know how folks can find that quite annoying. At the same time, there's some information I do want to share with you. So I'm going to assume folks can see my screen. And just maybe, start with the picture that I've got shown here. Is of the upper area of the valley in which the proposed Palmer project would take place. My understanding is it would essentially take place at the end of the valley and involve going underneath the glacier that's in the head of the valley. Needless to say, this is one of the places that mining and the mining activities and everything that go with it are juxtaposed against a very beautiful fragile landscape, and all too often this is what we see. Okay, what I'm going to do, first, really the objective I have is really to inform the attendees from an independent mining expert perspective. And I'm going to provide a little more presenter background to give you some idea where that perspective comes from, and how I got to literally where we are today. What I want to talk in particular about, though, is what is the Palmer project? What is the current stage of the project development? What does it mean that we have a preliminary economic assessment? And I'll go into that a bit more when we get there. What is the project, how does it compare to all the other copper and zinc mines, not just in Alaska or the US, but really globally. There's a question about barite production from the mine. And then last, but certainly not least, what are the environmental, financial, and social risks of the project? So just a little bit more about what I'm doing here, talking with all of you today. I was born in Butte, Montana, and this is a overhead picture of Butte. Butte is the largest Superfund site in North America. I wouldn't say it's the largest in the world. I've seen some sites in Russia that certainly would qualify as being larger were they Superfund sites, and should be. But certainly in North America, it's one of the largest Superfund sites. And I grew up kind of under the spectrum, if you will, of mining being something that was done. You accepted the consequences, and ultimately you had to pay for it. But hopefully you had somebody like the Atlantic Richfield Company to do so. But I've been involved in Superfund activity and some Superfund cleanup for more than 35 years now in Butte. Now, it's important to understand that I really ended up with two influences growing up. One was a grandfather who he struck it rich, if you will, in 1936. He and two other men sunk a hand winds. This is a hand winds actually shown here, down about 100 feet, got to a vein, hand sorted a carload of ore, shipped it to a smelter in Montana. Made $600 each, which I guess was a lot of money then. He went into construction, various other things. And I ended up, when I was 12 years old, he retired and decided to go back into small mining. Retired from construction and various other things. And I ended up first mining with him for a week when I was 12 years old, collaring and at it. By the time I was 16, I'd mined a lot of, I basically learned to mine from him as an underground miner. Very importantly, though, I had another grandfather who taught me that there was more than one kind of gold. And he really instilled in me a different set of values, a different outlook in life. And I can tell you that constantly, for years and years, those two different grandfathers weighed in different ways. I was raised in Utah, and that has a lot to do, at least in my mind, with some of the ways I am being independent. Not being LDS, being raised in Utah, you learn to really take your own opinions and own guidance and things. And certainly it influenced me to leave there as well and go to school in Montana rather than pursue other things. And instead of really being a professional tennis player and going to Cal Berkeley, which was my idea of what to do at 16, I ended up going to Montana School of Mines and becoming a mining and mineral processing engineer. That was back in 1983. And what I did initially in working in the industry was you went to where the jobs were. And that also allowed you to progress up the ladder. So I literally worked throughout the US, Canada, abroad in various other countries that I've shown here. It's actually not a complete list, but that allowed me to move up the ladder, if you will, ending up as a mine project manager in Nevada at the Northumberland mine in 1981. Ultimately, also became a consulting engineer working for a large equipment manufacturing firm. I like to talk to people about how I've worked from small mines to large mines, working with my grandfather in the larger mines. Ultimately, I worked for Anglo American for 6 years, and Anglo American was at that time the world's largest mining corporation. I came to my senses in about 1995. I credit my wife with having a lot to do with having helped me do that. We went basically on a 1-year sabbatical, if you will, and took time to do a lot of backpacking and other things. And I decided to head in a different direction. And beginning in 1996, started Kuipers and Associates. Not really sure exactly what I was going to do, but I ended up working for non-government organizations, tribes, and government. That was 25 years ago, and there are actually a few people on the phone. Hi, Will Patrick, by the way, who were on the phone that I met 25 years ago. And it's really kind of neat and fun to think of all the things we've done, even though I have to say it's never been in a situation that was ever straightforward, if you will. So let's get to the present. I've spent the last 25 years working with a lot of different groups, looking at a lot of different projects. And one of the things that I do is look at the economic evaluations and also look at projects as to where they're at in the process of being developed. So the Palmer project, which most of you know, is in Southeast Alaska, located about 60 kilometers from Haines. It's what we would term an advanced stage zinc, copper, gold, silver exploration project. And I'll get to describing a little bit more what that means here in a minute. It's also what we call a VMS deposit, or a volcanic massive sulfide deposit. And the reason that's important is those deposits in general have, in almost all cases that I'm aware of, been associated with acid mine drainage, mine influenced water that ultimately, in not all cases, but nearly all cases, leads to long-term requirements for water treatment, additional source controls, and certainly environmental costs that all too often at historic mines have led to taxpayer liabilities and become the Superfund sites like Butte. This particular deposit is high grade. They're talking about the equivalent of 9 and 10% zinc. Therefore, it's also something that they would look at as an underground mine. And they would do it pretty much by conventional means, flotation to produce copper and zinc concentrates. Those concentrates would need, though, to be shipped off-site for smelting. And we'll talk also a bit more about that later, but those would need to go literally somewhere other than the United States. Canada is one possibility, but more than likely somewhere such as Japan. And just coincidentally, Dow Metals owns 56% of the project. And Constantine, who is really the face of the project, if you will, who people talk to, who are the promoters of the project that you see every day, they own 44%. So really behind the whole thing, you have Dow Metals that may be looking at, acknowledgably, I think has suggested they're looking at the copper and zinc concentrates to be shipped to their smelters in Japan. So in terms of the current stage of project development, what this is a table I put together to explain to people the process of developing an exploration project ultimately to an actual mine. And there are a lot of different stages that you can see in this table. You start with, for example, exploration reconnaissance. And that's really sitting back in an office, maybe going some limited visits to the site, doing some limited testing and other things to really see if it's something where you have a deposit that's of interest to begin spending significantly more money. You start spending more money and finding out more about a project beyond just what's on the surface or in the existing literature as you begin working on what they call stage 3. And at that point, you're really doing a detailed surface appraisal of the target areas. You also begin doing a lot more sampling and analysis of the surface. Generally, you don't get real intrusive, if you will, in terms of beginning to do surface roads, drill holes, things of that nature. Now, stage 4 is when you're really trying to get a handle on a project. It's been justified through the first 3 stages in terms of what you found to begin working on that project. And that's part of where the existing project is. They're doing additional rotary drilling, core drilling. In some projects, they go in and take bulk samples, things of that nature. They also began doing things that we characterize in the pre-permitting stage, infill drilling and additional exploration would be the examples here that I've got highlighted for the Palmer project that are all part of what the company terms advanced stage exploration. Now, importantly, even though they've done some economic evaluations, and that's what we'll describe and talk more about in terms of the preliminary economic evaluation that they've done so far, they haven't done a feasibility study. And therefore, they really don't have valid project designs. They don't have what's necessary, at least in my opinion, and generally for permit applications. And so we don't actually have a project proposed yet, but what we do have is a project in the advanced stage of exploration. And it's important to note that each one of these stages can take years. There can be delays, result in even decades to get through and to each stage. And as you go down through this, also the odds of a project actually becoming a real project decrease. So you might start with literally 1,000 projects at stage one. You might end up with 100 that reach stage 3. Maybe of those 10 might proceed in through stage 4, but to actually go through permitting and particularly construction, at any given time, there may only be 1 or 2 or 3 projects actually doing that. And we're talking globally. And so it's important to kind of understand this relationship and also where Constantine is at the Palmer project with this one. So we'll dive a little deeper into the technical things here, and I'll try to keep it at least at a reasonable level. But when we talk about a preliminary economic assessment or a PEA, the intent really is that it's to guide the additional exploration work and assess options for mine development. It's not something that you hang a project proposal on. And it's very important to understand that. And in fact, the document that was produced for the Palmer project and the standards which it applies to, that are the general accepted standards for mineral projects in North America, make it very clear that a PEA is preliminary in nature. It's considered too speculative geologically to have economic considerations apply to it. And there's no certainty that PEA results will be realized. And essentially, what you need to understand, and people in the mining business understand, is you don't take a report like a PEA, wave it around and say, this is something that demonstrates the project is economically viable. And also this is going to be what the project is going to look like. You really haven't figured that kind of thing out yet. That's the business of pre-feasibility studies and really feasibility studies if you do things right. So it shouldn't be used as an actual basis for a mine plan. It actually isn't the best basis and shouldn't be used for environmental or social impact studies. It really doesn't give you the tonnage per day, the other characteristics necessary to do that. And really what it's just used for is the next step in deciding whether a mine should actually occur based upon further work that needs to be done. So another question that comes up is, how does this project compare to other projects that are out there? In particular, for example, the copper and zinc mines. And it's a good question, in my opinion, because oftentimes we are all given the impression that metals are scarce. They're valuable, they're precious. All these kind of connotations are given to metals. This idea that we're going to have to mine everywhere, for example, to fill green energy needs, other things, it's based upon a premise of scarcity. And when you really look at what's out there in terms of just known resources today, not additional exploration, that can occur to find new resources we didn't know about. And we're all the time finding that there are types of mineralizations and other locations that we haven't explored. But just if you take a look at what we know is out there today, what this graphic does is show for copper at least what that looks like. And so the graph shows on the left hand or y-axis, if you will, the copper equivalent grade. And I don't know if somebody's got their mute on or not. Okay. But if they would. But we've got a copper equivalent grade on the left-hand side, and then the size of the resource in millions of tons on the x-axis, or excuse me, on the y-axis, we have the 10%, and on the x, we have the mined resource. And what this shows is that for copper mines, we have all the different mines that have been closed, also all the different mines that are either operating, have been under development or construction, are presently in the feasibility stage, have been stalled, or maybe in exploration. I'm sorry, can people hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you, Jim. We're being Zoom bombed by somebody.
Okay. Well, I think it just sounds like somebody's got their mute off and there's a radio or something coming in. Yeah, actually, there's something else happening as well. So the short of it is, when you look at this graphic, what you see is there's a lot of projects that are undergoing feasibility, a lot of projects that are stalled. And what you don't know is, amongst all these different projects, what are actually going to be the projects that go forward. And so, this graphic is intended to show that. And importantly, what it shows that is this is all going to change as exploration occurs and other things take place over time. Another thing that the PEA talks about is barite production. Now, barite, just by way of background for folks, its primary use is as basically drilling mud in the oil and gas petroleum business. And its consumption, the amount that people actually need, and whether it's in demand, the price responding to that, all depends upon the oil and gas business. And as most people are aware, right now, and probably for quite a while in the conceivable future, there aren't going to be a lot of new additional oil and gas wells being drilled. Not going to say there aren't going to be any, but the amount going forward, particularly because of the situation where we drilled a lot of wells and then overproduced over the last short while, that's going to mean that barite's not greatly in demand. But I wouldn't say it's a absolute necessity for the project, but an important part of the project's economics is the production of barite. And at this point, there's really a lot of questions. I've listed some of the aspects here in terms of, is there a market? Do you have a port? Will the barite meet the kind of specifications? I'm very curious to see how that might work. And so that's one of the things that are being asked for here. Ultimately, they need to do metallurgical testing. And it's the kind of example of additional work that the company needs to do to prove what they're trying to do. Okay. Now, additionally, there's some other environmental, financial, and social risks of the project. Those risks include things like metal prices, operating and capital costs, site-specific risks, barite marketability, and environmental considerations. Now, in terms of metal prices, I tried to put up and get some plots of zinc prices to show you, but the project is really going to be highly dependent on zinc prices. And zinc prices, when you look over the last 25 years, what you see is they've fluctuated within a certain range, but really in terms of keeping up with inflation, haven't done so at all. There are a large number of zinc projects that I'm aware of that are in what we would call the stalled category. They may have viability at some point in the future, maybe something that somebody can look at. I can see somebody is riding over a thing. Could people see that? Hopefully not, but if so. But it's this kind of.
Yeah, apologies, everyone. And we can return.
Okay.
Thanks for hanging with us, everyone. My apologies, Mr. Kuipers.
Not a problem. And none of us want this kind of thing to happen for sure. Okay, let me see. So one of the other risks for any mining project, and this is a very significant risk for this project because of the fact that we're dealing with a lot of different site-specific factors. But this is something I've been talking with folks about for the last 20 years, and only recently, and there we have somebody going again, but only recently have actually seen a good, I think I may have just solved it by clicking on off the annotate on shared content.
Okay, great.
Which we'll see if the annotation that somebody was doing, showing us their wonderful skills with the English language still are occurring. So,
Thanks.
okay.
Great.
This graphic, and again, I want to just make sure folks understand what they did here. This is a survey of 41 major projects that was done between 2008 and 2018. These are all with a capital expenditure of greater than 500 million. And I think pretty certainly the Constantine project falls into that category. But they surveyed 40 plus mining projects. And basically what it shows is an average overrun of 60% versus the costs that were projected in the feasibility study. Now, that's 60%, just so folks know, that's an enormous overrun, particularly when most of these projects only have a margin, an internal rate of return, if you will, of 20 or 30%. That's for a very, very good project. So it's a good example of what can happen. Not any project is going to, with any certainty, be in any one of these categories. But some of these projects have actually resulted in what they term as corporate disasters. And those are projects, 1 in 5, in fact, of those projects they surveyed, ended up 100% and on average 300% over budget. That is the kind of thing that can actually kill a corporation, kill a project. And the issue is that it's also the kind of thing that can lead to projects starting but later going bankrupt. Now, there's some other site-specific risks identified in the PEA. A lot of you know this area fairly well and are aware of some of these things already. But it lists things like avalanche and portal construction. Those are two very site-specific factors, particular to the geology, the area that you saw in the picture at the beginning of the presentation. The next is the AG deposit metallurgy. Metallurgy can always be tricky, and you want to make sure you get it right because that's what you're really trying to do in terms of recovering the resource. You have things like site surface geotechnical conditions, meaning really we're looking at, is the ground stable? And can it support various facilities, roads, other features that are there? And needless to say, this site presents some real challenges in that respect. Water management, again, when we look at where we would prefer to have sites, I think without question, There's a large preference for sites where we don't have things like glaciers. We don't have a lot of surface water and groundwater. That always presents some real issues. Places that are seismic zones with high earthquake occurrences. And when the earthquakes occur, they're big earthquakes. That's an issue. Geochemistry relating to acid drainage, things of that nature. We have things like dust management. And then you can't really talk a project of this nature without recognizing that there are real post-closure site-specific risks in terms of requirements for long-term monitoring, maintenance, very possibly water treatment. Now, the PEA being a kind of very early document, something that really isn't, PEAs aren't good, if you will, at identifying a lot of these risks and other things and dealing with them, other than to simply say, well, these are things we can identify, but they always assume that the risks can be mitigated. It doesn't assume any additional caveats or contingencies, and therefore it doesn't assume any additional costs. And each one of these things by themselves could add additionally to the costs, also delay the project, have various other impacts on the project. But at the same time, together, they're the kind of thing that can really make a project not viable. And so part of what the PEA has done is identify these. What the company really has to do, though, going forward is identify and determine and really provide convincingly that these risks can be dealt with. And that's part of what they're working on today, if you will. In terms of the barite marketability, I think more than anything else, what it depends upon is whether there's a real market. And with the petroleum industry in the situation it is right now, the demand for barite isn't exceptionally high. It's also important to note that the idea that you're going to take barite from this resource is quite different than what's done today. The barite that has been used in the past for drilling mud and other things comes from barite deposits that are essentially just barite. They don't contain a lot of other minerals and other things. They're high-grade deposits. And as such, they don't have a risk of containing other metals and other things that actually can end up being contaminant for drilling mud and things. And really the whole idea of a byproduct sale of it, well, I think in many ways, I like the idea of more product and other things being sold, more things coming out of any given mine. I have to say, I think it's highly speculative at this time, at least. Now, last but not least, when I talk about the environmental considerations, of course, that's something that a lot of us have a lot of concern with, knowing the history of mines like this, other mines in the state of Alaska and elsewhere. We don't really have a reclamation plan, and there's been no cost estimate for reclamation calculated. The PEA hasn't gone into that kind of detail, really on mining and mineral processing or environmental, any area of that. Instead, what the PEA has done is they've taken the Greens Creek mine reclamation, excluding water treatment, and assume that even though this mine sure looks and smells a lot like Greens Creek, it won't require water treatment, and it seems we hear that every time. So what they've done is take the Greens Creek estimate of 102.6 million, that includes 30 million in long-term water treatment costs, and then they've taken out the water treatment and scaled it. So you have about a $70 million Greens Creek reclamation cost without water treatment. And they've said this project is a little less than half that size, and so therefore we think it'll cost about 30.8 million. And again, excluded the water treatment. A conservative approach, an approach that I think more accurately said, if we're going to use an example, let's use the example and not suggest that we're going to be the exception. certainly would have not taken out the water treatment costs, and the cost would have been higher in the PEA. There's a number of other things in terms of it. Basically assumes that there will be no discharge from the tailings or the waste rock facility requiring treatment. Again, I've mentioned that the geochemistry associated with the deposit is very similar to that of Greens Creek. And what we know today with Greens Creek is, again, in its time, when it was similarly being permitted up front, it originally predicted was permitted on the premise that there would be no water treatment. Today, it's recognized that it will require long-term treatment. It'll exceed 100 years, essentially be very long-term. We don't know how long-term. And it is, in fact, required, at least that first 100 years, is required as part of the financial assurance for Greens Creek. So again, I think the same kind of scenario, particularly when the company is making those kind of suggestions up front, is very likely to occur here. One other thing is, again, the assumption that the barite would be sold, that actually decreases the amount of tailings that would need to be impounded by about 25%, fairly significant amount. The PEA doesn't account for that. And so in terms of the larger picture for environmental, these are broad estimates, but I think it's something that is not out of the ballpark, is ultimately once the project goes through all the design facets and other things that I would consider necessary, the mitigation that you need, various other aspects, it would not be surprising if an additional 100 million needed to be spent upfront for source controls, for liners, for better ways of reducing the amount of pollutants that are discharged, various things of that nature, in addition to another 100 million at reclamation closure, including some funding for this project for long-term water treatment. And again, I would note that for Greens Creek, there's about $30 million presently estimated for that water treatment being necessary to pay for the first 100 years. The big thing that we always want to make sure and that we're trying to prevent here is if a mine occurs, we don't end up with potential public liability. And so that's one of the reasons I emphasize both the reclamation costs, but also the need to make sure any of these costs are addressed in financial assurance. And we're nowhere near to the point of knowing what a real reclamation plan and those real costs, as well as the amount of financial assurance should or would be. So just conclusions, and then we'll go to questions, any comments anybody wants to make. The Palmer project is late stage, but it's still speculative, meaning it's not a project that is on the books, ready to go, in the process of being permitted and various other things. It's not a certain project yet. The PEA, the document they've produced, does not demonstrate that it's an actual project. The project would produce zinc. And there are a lot of different metals that people talk about being needed, critical minerals, green minerals, and other things, but zinc is not one that is particularly needed to address future minerals demand. And I really don't see the pricing for zinc reflecting that anytime soon anything different. We've talked about, when I mentioned, all the different site-specific aspects of the project. And those site-specific aspects, each one by itself makes the project a challenge, but combined, I think you really have to look at, recognize that there's significant challenges overall. I think it's very important that additional work be undertaken by the owners. And my experience has been all too many projects have been started sometimes on PEAs, and certainly that's something you want to do, but even projects that are initiated, permitted, forward based upon pre-feasibility studies, really lack the kind of definition that you need to have that a feasibility study provides. And I'm working with some situations today where the mining companies themselves have very clearly stated that they regret not having done those feasibility studies before they began permitting, even more so began mine development, and wish they had approached things differently. So in addition to all this, just one last comment, and I actually have the wrong, instead of international, it has a different acronym, but the whoops, and there goes my screen. But IRMA, the Responsible Mining Assurance Standard, and DAWA need to be transparent in what they're doing, and DAWA can look to the IRMA standard for that transparency. And the idea is that the standard would be used as a guidance for them, and really be used by them to ultimately make a decision as to whether the project should proceed, and if it should proceed, how to go about doing that. And one of the key aspects that they need to do is DAWA as the owner needs to be involved, and they need to involve the affected community before making those decisions. And so that's really where I wanted to end, if I can, and allow for any questions, comments, other things that folks want to talk about tonight. And actually, I want to mention that I should have said the initiative, not the International Responsible Mining Assurance, and I'll have to apologize to the IRMA folks tomorrow for making that mistake as I wrote this up this afternoon.
Thanks, Jim. I guess we'll go ahead and take questions. Unfortunately, there's some profanity in the chat that I can't figure out how to get rid of, but folks are welcome to use the chat, or I believe you can unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can raise a hand. I'll try to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, maybe try raising your hand. If you look at the bottom of the control bar, there are reactions, a little smiley face with a plus on it. Under that icon, you can find raise hand, or you can just put your question in the chat, because we did have to mute everyone.
I see that Ben Kirkpatrick has his hand up. Can you unmute yourself, Ben?
Okay, I think this is working.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. One question I have, Jim, thanks a lot for the presentation. I really appreciate it, and having heard your name for many years, I was glad to at least see your face. You indicated there near the end that some of the mines you worked with regretted proceeding to permitting without going beyond the PEA. Now, for some reason, my understanding was that that the mining companies were required to go to the next step, the feasibility study. But maybe that's just protocol or something that's recommended but not necessarily required. So could Constantine or some other mining companies just proceed to permitting even though they're only at this stage, or is that just something for maybe funders? If they could find somebody who's willing to put up the money, they could just go ahead to permitting?
Well, it really depends upon two different factors. One is whether you're going to publicly disclose the information, and you're a company listed, for example, on a stock exchange. The SEC, if you're on the New York Stock Exchange in the US or Toronto Stock Exchange, you're required to comply with certain regulations. And in that situation, you would, if you were going to say that we have X amount of valid reserves, you would need to actually do that in such a way that complied. And if you wanted to get to the point where you were saying we have a bankable document that could be relied upon by banks and other lenders, as well as other entities, then you would need to do that. Now, if you're a private company, and Dowa, for example, and this is where I think it's interesting in this case. So Constantine, I think because of how they put their information out, how they're listed, is required to go through the process of disclosure. But Dowa, if they were so to choose and basically provide all the capital and other funding, would not necessarily require that same level of information. Internally, they might, and I would suggest, I would hope they would, but that is not necessarily required, and certainly not required to be disclosed to the public in all cases. So it's good business practice without question, but not always does business do the best practice, if you will.
Sorry, Ben, did you get your question answered there? Take that as a yes and move on to Kaylee Warner. You have your hand up.
Hello, not actually Kaylee, I'm Riley over here, just sharing a computer. And thanks for the presentation. That was pretty educational on that. I was curious with the project though, you're talking about not having mines fall into becoming public liability. And I was seeing, is there any examples in the past in the state of Alaska of a mine that's no longer operating, not becoming a public liability?
I'm trying to actually recall what the ultimate outcome was of both Nixon Fork and I want to say Illinois Creek, both of which I think dipped pretty heavily into the state bond fund that was intended and broader. I think those would maybe be two examples I'm aware of. Not aware of any other big examples like we've had elsewhere, say, for example, associated with Pegasus Gold in Montana, also with Galactic Resources in Colorado. Those are more typical examples that we've seen elsewhere.
Okay, and what out of these two mining companies, Dow and Constantine, have they had any mines that they've produced and everything in the past that they have had not become public liability?
Yeah, no, Constantine, to my knowledge, has not been a past producing mining company. They're essentially a exploration development company, and this would be their first actual mine development were it to occur. Dow, of course, in Japan, their situation there is quite different. I'm not even sure they require financial assurance for mines in Japan. And that's where, to my knowledge, their mines have been in the past.
Let's see.
So we don't, these two companies don't have a history in Alaska or the US. Really.
All right. Now maybe this is more on a opinion part, but doesn't that seem a little concerning, for a company, assuming that the companies are going to be 100% self-sufficient after they're done mining, since most mines that I've at least read about and seen in the past almost always fall into being public liability because, if you have a overhead to do the remediation and environmental monitoring, it doesn't really matter how much you're pulling out when at the end of the day, you still have to pay someone to go out there and check it out when you're not making money anymore.
Yeah, no, and I would agree with you. My experience, and again, a lot of what I've worked on over the last 25 years for public interest groups, for EPA, others, has been to research and study mines, and really look, are there long-term liabilities, or can we expect to walk away from these mines? And with very few exceptions, the answer is we're not going to be able to walk away from them. And mines like this in particular, just given the nature of the geology, the sulfide nature, the fact that we have water and other things happening here, it's something that I think in many ways we have to just anticipate is going to be required. And therefore, it's important that we account for that and have financial assurance. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hey, Jim, you mentioned Pegasus. Could you talk a little bit about the situation down there with Pegasus? And then Zortman Landusky also is kind of in a similar situation, right?
Yeah, so if we step back 25 years ago, and again, I'll shout out Will Patrick, okay, because I think it was actually at Zortman Landusky that I first met Will about 25 years ago, or at least we were working on Zortman Landusky together. But when what happened was Pegasus Gold Mining Company started out as a junior gold mining company, began to purchase and develop lots of different gold mines in Montana, various other places in the US, as well as ultimately buying a big mine in Australia. And as time went on, they accumulated a lot of built up debt for mines that they were operating and would at some point close in the future. And in a way, what they were doing was always counting on the next generation of mines to pay for the past generation. And at the same time, the amount of financial assurance that was being estimated wasn't keeping up with what was happening at the mines. So we had two things happening. One, they're not putting the money in, but the money also they're asked to put in wasn't keeping up. Well, what happened is 1996, 97, the company declared bankruptcy. And originally they said, well, we're not going to go completely bankrupt. We'll just operate the mines. We'll do the reclamation using the funding that's available, kind of pay themselves out of the natural assurance to do it, form a new company and proceed from there. Well, that only lasted about a year. They completely pulled up stakes and left the BLM and Montana DEQ with Zortman mine, Landusky mine, the Beal Mountain mine, several others in Montana, various other mines. And I should mention it was because of a zinc mine that they bought in Australia that completely went bankrupt with the zinc price that kind of made all their gold mines go down. But anyway, they went bankrupt. Basically, the state BLM had to take them over. And there were very large shortfalls in the amount of monies available to clean up these mines. And some of the first work I did 25 years ago was to work with people to come up with revised reclamation plans to see if we could not do an adequate job of reclamation at these mines that Pegasus left with the remaining reclamation funds. And we did our best, but it wasn't close. And ultimately, the taxpayer liability from Pegasus bankruptcy, we don't know yet, truthfully, because we're not through cleaning up. That happened in 1996. There are mines like the Beal Mountain mine. It's still in the process of being figured out and remediated, but in the neighborhood of $100 million plus dollars in taxpayer liability.
Thanks, Jim. Will, Patrick, go ahead.
Hey, Jim, I just want to say hi and thank you very much for a couple shout outs my way. That's really nice. And just want to say really good presentation and very clear and just really excellent information. My question was early on, you mentioned that the metal processing would have to happen outside the United States, I guess. And you said maybe Canada, but overseas. And I'm curious, I guess I don't know why that is, first of all. And second, does that affect the economics?
Yeah, no, it's not well known, I think, yet to what extent we no longer have capacity in North America to smelt the metals that we might produce. Zinc being a very good example. Particularly in the United States, we no longer have a zinc smelter anywhere in the US. I believe the last remaining one in North America is at Trail. Actually, it may be in Quebec, but I believe there's only one left in Canada now. And in terms of copper, there are also only a few smelters left, almost all of which in North America already have captive capacity in terms of there are already mines that speak to all the capacity that exists. And so any new production of zinc and or copper concentrates is most likely going to end up needing to go to Asia. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about critical minerals and the need to mine the minerals here in the US so that they can be utilized here in the US and we can have a secure supply chain. But if the metals have to be sent to Asia and ultimately from Asia to Europe or China to manufacture into parts and other things to go into end products, then we really haven't done much to accomplish anything in terms of addressing that supply chain issue and you know whether or not these things are critical minerals or not. So that's one of the reasons it's important. And then, as you mentioned, it really is also a matter of cost. The further you have to go, the more your shipping costs are. Typically, also in Asia, the smelting is more restrictive. They don't like things like arsenic in the concentrate. And that's one of the things that's very likely to become an issue in this situation. And then finally, you know, the whole idea is that to the extent we mine minerals going forward, we need to be very smart about where we do that, how we do that, so we create the least carbon emissions that we can per pound of metal produced. And so anytime we're shipping things a great distance from where we're producing them, anytime we're producing metals in an isolated location that requires shipment in of fuel and supplies and everything else, that's something I think we need to weigh into the equation.
Very helpful. Yeah, thank you. Interesting.
Thanks, Will. Looks like we've got a question in the text. Question is, with the PEA, do they look at locations for tailings dumps, or is that later on in the feasibility stage?
No, and I'm glad you asked that question because that's part of what I think really needs to be clarified. They generally don't look and go through what one would call a tailings site assessment, where you take a look at all the different options. A PEA really looks most typically at what is kind of the most obvious location. What might be location that is least cost and appears to provide the minimum requirements of maybe some flat ground or at least reasonably flat ground, things of that nature. But again, it really doesn't provide the kind of site assessment, particularly for tailings storage facilities, given current standards, that you would want to conduct to ensure that you didn't just find the minimum required characteristics, but you really looked for the best or an ideal tailings storage facility location. So yes, I mean, the answer is it really is the kind of thing you look at beginning with the pre-feasibility stage And again, this is a good example of why this all needs to be thought through in terms of permitting as well. The permit ultimately could change where you're going to locate the tailings. And at that point, you need to turn back around and also redo your feasibility study to incorporate that. So while a PEA says the tailings could go here, that's not necessarily, and it's part of why it's not what I consider a document for permitting that says it should in fact go there. That makes sense.
Right. And there's a follow-up question, which is, has Palmer identified tailing storage locations? And you can answer this. I can kind of answer it based on what I've seen too from permit applications and such, is that they've identified some possibilities, right? You know, they've thrown out an assortment of options.
Yep, no, and that's exactly it. But by no means have those options been vetted, for example, by an internal technical or an independent technical review board, such as the global standard for tailings management would require. And we would hope they would, at a minimum, follow that standard.
Another question from the chat. Does the regulatory environment in the state assist in providing safer mining?
Now, that's a loaded question. So, you know, I when we talk about safer, I want to kind of define that a second as meaning loss of human life in particular, and getting to things like tailings storage facility failures. And folks are familiar with the Mount Poly failure that occurred in nearby British Columbia about 7 years ago now in 2014. But also the more recent Brumadinho failure, where 300 plus people lost their lives in an instantaneous failure, if you will, of an actual closed tailings facility. And so kind of getting to the question in terms of, does the state assist in providing safer mining? I would tell you that that is the intention of the state, is to assist in providing safer mining. And they have provided some useful guidance in that regard. And I would credit them with being one of the few states that has provided additional guidance. But I live in Montana. We like to think of ourselves as pretty progressive. And our state actually passed regulations in 2015 based upon the findings of the Mount Poly expert review panel that were provided in January 2015. So they acted very quickly. I was part of assisting in writing those regulations. It was a bipartisan, passed bipartisan in Montana, where we have you know, a majority Republican legislature. And they are by far the most progressive regulations. And I emphasize regulations versus guidance, because regulations, you know, they have to be followed. They're not voluntary. They're not a maybe if you should, but rather you shall. And the regulations in Montana set a very high bar. I've worked through those regulations with a couple of companies now, and I think anybody would have to be impressed. And so Alaska, while I would say it certainly is their intent to assist in providing safer mining, it really falls far short of what I would say does assure safer mining, because they rely upon guidance and not actual regulation to make the same requirements.
Jim, while you're talking about regulations down there in Montana, can you describe the Montana bad actor law, which was a law that was passed also by a Republican legislature, I believe, and signed by Judy Martz, who was a Republican governor?
Sure, there may be others. I don't know, could certainly speak to it better, but I can do the best I can. You know, as you said, it was passed some time ago by our Republican governor and legislature. And the intent behind it is that if you've been a executive in a mining company that made bad decisions that ended up saddling the state of Montana with liability, that didn't comply with permit regulations. All that kind of meets the definition of Pegasus Gold, if you will, that we talked about earlier. Then you aren't going to be able to go ahead and apply for another permit in the state, as long as those past violations are still have not been entirely addressed. And it just so happens that one of Hecla's mining company's executives, and Hecla is proposing the Rock Creek project in Montana underneath the wilderness area. One of their executives, in fact, their chief executive, as I understand it, he was also an executive for Pegasus Gold some 25 years ago. And what's particularly bothersome, I think, to everybody on the side that's looking at this in terms of what should happen is, under the previous administration, which was a Democrat administration, it was decided that they had, in fact, were in violation of that act. Hecla was having this particular corporate officer. And the expectation was that DEQ would go ahead and prosecute and essentially say, Hecla, as long as he's your officer, we can't continue to move forward with your permits. But instead, we got a new governor in the state of Montana. I'll just try not to say anything unkind, but he's definitely of the other side of the equation, if you will. And he's gone ahead and informed the new director of Montana Department of Environmental Quality that they will not be moving forward with that prosecution. And therefore, if Hecla wants to continue with the same corporate officer and try to permit the mine, they can. And folks are reasonably upset about that development.
Okay, next question from the chat. Is it usual for a project at this stage to not know how it will ship product to market?
You know, unfortunately, I can't say it's unusual. It's, again, a good example of not good planning, not good getting all your ducks in a row, and the kind of thing that can create issues in terms of cost, logistics, delays later. And so it's all too often the case. What I would suggest, if it's a project that is responsibly managed, is the kind of project you really want to see go forward, even if you, from a mining industry standpoint, you would have a lot more information than certainly what it appears they have right now in terms of going to market. I'd say it's probably much more unusual and much more critical that they have that information when they get to a pre-feasibility study. And particularly, I think that information would be critical to know before the project is actually a permit application is submitted for the project. And so it's the kind of information that it's lacking now, that to some extent is reasonable in the PEA, but it certainly is the kind of thing that I would hope, expect that they would do more work on between now and if they actually propose a mining project to go forward.
Thank you. Next question. Constantine has said that the Palmer deposit is like that at Windy Craggy. Can you speak to that?
Oh, I certainly can. So about 30 years ago, when I was working for Anglo American, one of the things I did was work in their acquisitions group. And for those of you not real familiar with the Windy Craggy deposit, it was being promoted, I believe, by Murray Pesum, who a lot of folks know from other mining projects at the time. And it was being promoted as a spectacular world-class deposit, with one little caveat: it is in the middle of nowhere. And the company I worked for took a great deal of interest in the project. We actually spent quite a bit of time. I remember flying over the site We weren't able to land the day we were supposed to visit the site, but we at least got to approach the site, if you will. It was scary. Okay, I don't know how else to describe it in terms of the logistics, the idea of mining in that kind of terrain, that kind of area, and ultimately, as people are aware, it was realized by the various entities involved that, you know, this really is a good example of a project. Let's not do it, and let's instead, you know, very appropriately look at this area as something that has greater values that should be protected, and that, you know, we will just simply cancel this project. And certainly, in my opinion, it made sense. The company, in comparing it to Wendy Craggy, it's an interesting comparison, in my opinion, because the comparison they make is really trying to focus on, is it, you know, also a world-class deposit? And comparing it to Windy Crag before that, I believe, when really the thing I would look at is it a viable deposit in terms of looking at it and comparing it to Windy Craggy in terms of economics, environment, and other aspects.
Thank you. Any more questions? I don't see any more in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand. Looks like Ben's got his hand up again. Go ahead, Ben. Can you unmute yourself, Ben?
There we go. Okay. Well, one thing I wanted to get a clarification on, Jim, was you talked about financial insurances. Now, generally, it seems that that term is related to reclamation. But is there any case where financial assurances are used for operational failures, so to speak, whether, you know, it's a tailings dam failure, a blowout of, you know, something in the mine, or is these financial insurances strictly related to reclamation of the project when it's finished?
Now, this is a question I think more people, I would actually wish they'd ask it, because it helps me kind of provide a clarification of what is common and what is not common, and maybe what should be. Okay, so you alluded, you know, in your question to, is it for what's planned and what's expected to occur, you know, what's in the reclamation plan, and that's exactly what financial assurance does. When the company writes up the reclamation plan, everything goes as expected. The mitigation that they said they were going to do, they do. Vegetation, other things at the end is done. That's what financial assurance, as it's presently required by the state of Alaska, by the Corps of Engineers, various other entities, addresses. It very explicitly does not address unplanned events like a tailings storage facility failure. And really the whole idea is you're supposed to do everything in such a way that that failure would never occur. Now, I'm never going to be the engineer that's going to make that statement, just so you know. There's things called black swans. There's things that as engineers, even the best engineer out there or group of engineers cannot predict what might happen 100% of the time with 100% accuracy. So I believe that there's always a possibility of failure with any tailings storage facility that we would, you know, classify as having potential to take human life if it did fail. So the idea is that in addition to financial assurance, we would like companies to do an estimate, first to do an analysis of what a failure would look like, breach analysis, and what we call reasonable worst case analysis for that breach. You know, and an example would be a failure during a flood event. So you kind of had a flood failure on top of a flood, which creates even a greater amount of flooding and damage. You would do an assessment of the human life toll, you would do an assessment of the property damage, infrastructure damage, things like that. And then ultimately the company would be required to obtain an insurance policy. Insurance, not financial assurance, from a valid provider for that event. Now that's something that is not required by most states and federal agencies, but I would note that the state of Minnesota, their regulations do in fact require exactly what I just described. And it is a recommendation, for example, of the publication Safety First that Earthworks and other organizations have put together concerning tailings. And so it's an additional aspect that mines that operate responsibly, the mines that want to assure against taxpayer liability would have in place. And there's one other aspect I just want to mention why I think it's very important. And that is, if an insurance company is going to give you a policy for $1 billion and involve themselves in something that acknowledgeably can involve the loss of human life, they're going to help you run that facility. They're going to step in and not just depend upon the corporation to do the right thing, but I believe they would take a very active role in helping those corporations ensure that they never had to that kind of event never occurred, so they did have to pay out on it. And so it not only would be in place if it did happen, but I think very importantly would serve as just one more big deterrent to allowing for irresponsible, or not allowing for irresponsible projects to occur. So it's appreciate the opportunity to kind of make that clarification between the two, because yeah, financial assurance is a good thing, but it certainly doesn't speak to the various different types of things that might happen that haven't been planned for.
Okay, next question from the chat. Jim, given your expertise, do you think the benefits of this project are worth the risks and the potential downsides for the residents of the Jilkaat Valley? If you lived in the Jilkaat Valley with your family, would you think this project is worth the potential downsides?
Well, I'm going to chicken out a little bit, Meredith, okay, and say that, this is what I believe the residents of Jilkaat Valley and other affected stakeholders themselves need to decide. And more than anything, what needs to happen is there needs to be a process that you get to be a real meaningful part of that decision. And if, one thing is obvious to me so far, that's not happening. The company is working primarily with the people who are the mine advocates. And the way you do this, if you want to do it right, you really, step up and as a company, you say, well, we also want to sit down. We want to enable, we want to provide whatever is necessary for the community that might not be jumping up and down for us to also engage with us. And ultimately, we don't want to make a decision about whether a mine should go ahead until we've done that. So, I think it's one that I will say there's a lot of value to places like the Jilkaat Valley. And those have to be weighed against the value of minerals extraction. And traditionally that hasn't occurred. And that's not going to happen simply through the state and or federal regulatory processes. It'll only happen if the company really decides to step forward and do it and says they want to do this project right. So no, while I certainly can appreciate everybody's concerns with it, and I certainly would have my own concerns, I want to ultimately suggest that it is in fact the residents there, the other stakeholders that need to make that decision.
Next question is, if you have time, would you comment on the social impacts of having a mine in our community for a decade or so?
Yeah, well, and this is the thing, it's for a decade or so. If you're lucky, it'll last the amount of time they said it would. It might go longer. It might go that time. If I had to actually step back for a minute and tell everybody what I have the greatest concerns about with any mining project, even though so much of the work that I do is on the environmental end, it actually is on the social impact side of things. I've lived in these communities. I've come into them when before the mine was there. I've gone back to them after we left and various other things. Mines change communities. And oftentimes what happens is, first you oftentimes see changes that are not pleasant in terms of construction crews, people that are there very temporarily and tend to live a pretty tough life, and other things that come in. Oftentimes they're followed by a period of prosperity. Folks are able to pay their bills. They decide to add on to their homes. They buy a new truck. Seen exactly these kind of things happen. But then one day you're sitting there as the mine manager and you talk with the headquarters and you realize, yeah, we're going to shut down in 3 months, or maybe it's even in as little as 3 weeks. And you've got to be the one to inform all these folks that, sorry, but plans have changed, or maybe you should have been paying attention to what we said we were going to do all along. But this is coming to an end. And when it comes to an end, all those benefits in terms of jobs and schools and infrastructure and other things that seem so great, they're a lot different when you don't have the money to continue doing them, to do the upkeep, various other things. And I always remember Austin, Nevada, nice one-room schoolhouse. They didn't have issues with their budget, maybe not the greatest situation, but they had gotten by for a long time there. Mining company I was working for, we came in, they needed to build a new school. They built a school for 100 kids, hired the teachers and everything else. And then we pulled up stakes after 3 years. And they were left with this very expensive building, basically a setup that they couldn't afford. And they really had a lot of difficulties after that. And so that's my personal biggest concern, is the social impacts and the boom and bust economics that mining creates. And I think it's one of the biggest challenges for the mining industry and communities that depend upon mining, is how to actually make this a sustainable project, that be as part of providing for a sustainable ecosystem. And to me, that's again, one of the reasons why there really needs to be a lot more conversation that goes on beyond just the regulatory arena and requirements that largely are well, really just are limited to environmental issues to the extent they address those.
Next question from the chat is: the Jilkaat Valley has increasingly unstable weather patterns and sometimes experiences extreme precipitation events. How could extreme weather affect a mine prospect like Palmer? And should we be concerned about living downstream of a massive sulfide mine?
Well, this gets into the whole climate change discussion and things of that nature. I guess we all, I believe, continually see evidence of that. You folks in Alaska, particularly folks in the native villages, even further up north than other places, I think you see it a whole lot more than most of us do. Recognize that we are definitely seeing things happen in terms of climate change. And one of those things, of course, is more extreme storm events, more precipitation in shorter periods of time in some areas, less in others, a lot more variability. There's actually in various places quite a bit of work being done to try to figure this out, because it does actually have significant import as to mining projects, whether it be projects where there's too little water, or projects with too much, projects susceptible to flood events. And the most difficult part that I can tell you is mines are taking, particularly more so the engineers that are advising mines, are trying to suggest they need to do things to address what's happening with the climate and make their projects more resilient, if you will. but we actually don't know what to do because we don't know where this is going and what to expect next, if you will. Every day seems to set new precedents. And as an engineer, that's what I work on, is precedents. And when that precedent is constantly changing, it's a little bit tricky. So again, it's a good example of where you really have to look hard at where these facilities would be located, what their risk is, where downstream residents and others are located. And that needs to be part of the decision-making process, not only as to where the projects are located, but even if they go forward at all.
Another question here for you. Says, I worked in BC, specifically on mining, the year that Mount Poly failed, and that sticks with me in these conversations. Appreciate your response. I guess that's not a question. Next one is there a point of no return in the process whereby it becomes impossible to block the mine's development due to mining laws?
Yeah, so due to mining laws, the regulations, essentially once a project has its permits in hand, it can go forward. Typically, there aren't any more legal restrictions that can stop it. I'm not going to say there's ever an absolute point of no return, because I've worked with some very creative attorneys. I've worked with some people who have been incredibly, they just did things that I never expected them to do to keep mines from happening, if you will. But generally, once you got your permits, the mine is going to, from a legal standpoint, have the ability to go forward. Now, it still has to be financed, ultimately constructed, and various other things. So the point of return really doesn't happen until they actually build the mine. But certainly from a mining law standpoint, that's why companies look at getting their permits as, a very, very key stage in the development of a project.
Looks like Aaron has his hand up. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, so to that point, Jim, one of the things that really strikes me is at this stage, Constantine as a mining junior losing control of the project, losing majority stake, and not being able to raise exploration funding around it. To me, that seems a little bit unusual. And can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I'll try, Aaron. And first, I think it's important that they've already lost their majority stake to Dowa. Okay, and so what I would expect going forward is that any investment, and this happened recently where Dowa upped their ownership, any investment going forward is most likely going to come from Dowa, and not necessarily from Constantine raising more additional money. They could, and I'm not saying it wouldn't happen that way, but that's kind of how it appears at this point. And why, again, Dowa is really in a position to call the shots in so many different ways right now, because if somebody else funds the additional development costs, then that really would dilute Dowa's interest. And so, that's basically, I think, what the equation is for this particular project.
So now that Dow is the majority partner, is it unusual in your experience for the owner of one of these projects, the majority owner, to not communicate at all, with the community? Or, I don't know that they even communicate with the regulators. They still rely on the junior partner for all of that.
No, so I think there's two parts that are interesting that you alluded to. One is it's simply not usual that the majority partner looks to the minority partner to be the operator, much less be pretty much the entire face and spokesperson for the project. So yeah, again, that's one of the, probably, perhaps it may be the most unusual thing about this particular project. It's the one that is probably the one that's makes it most difficult to kind of suggest what's going to happen, is the fact that Dowa is here as a majority owner, but isn't really an active participant in any way. At least we can see, if you will.
Another question from the chat. Does the building of a 1-mile exploration tunnel set any precedents that make it more difficult to stop the development of the project to a full-scale mining operation?
Well, I don't know in terms of precedents, because there are other projects like that. It does make it more difficult because as part of what you have to do is to get that development tunnel put in order to get back in and do additional exploration to find out what's there. It's actually fairly common, though, in these larger underground mines that are now being developed, that you would have to do an exploration tunnel. I'm working on one here in Montana with the mining company and the groups that I represent, where it's over 3 miles of tunnel as part of their exploration to get back to where the ore deposit is. So it's expensive. It can be complicated. A good example is they can plan on it taking a year, and it ends up taking 3 or 4 years. And it can result in unexpected things like a whole bunch of water being encountered and needing to be handled and treated. But it doesn't really set, if you will, a precedent per se.
Eric Hawley, you have your hand up.
I did. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep, you sound fine.
Thanks for your presentation, Jim. Appreciate it very much. How desperately does the world need copper, zinc, gold, barite? What are the other sources that are available? I mean, I think without even looking deeply into it, nobody needs pennies anymore. They're mostly zinc and copper. There have to be huge supplies of, recyclable plumbing products. And what do you know about urban mining? I read in some of the trade journals that it's actually more efficient to go into landfills and other urban sites and extract mineral wealth from those places. I'll just leave the question at that. Thank you.
Well, gee, Eric, that's only a question I could maybe spend an hour or so trying to answer. Probably not do it justice. Okay, that's not an easy one. In a bigger picture, and recently part of a discussion at it was a Zoom meeting like this, and some COP26 participants and other things. There's a lot of discussion about how much mineral the world's going to need, how desperately we need it, where it should come from. All those kind of things. And it's interesting because, one part of the discussion is about continuing to feed our existing and ever needing to grow economy and have our luxuries that all of us enjoy in our developed world and other things. But another, and that suggests that all these minerals might have a certain level of importance. Challenge gold, certainly, but as long as we keep on the present economic system, probably even that one could be listed. The other part of the conversation, though, particularly that I was hearing from indigenous people, from people in developing countries and third world countries, was that, number one, they see themselves as being overly impacted, in order to obtain all these things for all of us to continue our way of life. But even more so, what they keep pointing out is that, the demand for all these minerals and other things is so we continue our high levels of consumption. And the idea of converting everything to green energy well, maybe we ought to look at more, do we just simply need to have all this energy that we keep having? So where I'm at right now is still trying to figure out this very complex picture. There are things like discussions of recycling. If we in fact need to get a lot of metals out there for green, probably in the short term, we're not going to get there recycling, not even come close. At the same time, we probably need to figure out how not to need the quantities of metals that are being discussed and thrown out there, and realize that we really are going to have to think about this in a much different context than our traditional economic system in the way that we all do today. So, the answer to your question, I guess, is somewhat, it's out there for that to be figured out as to how this would work in terms of demand and how it would affect the demand for the Constantine project in particular. But I think it's a good example of why this all needs to be given more thought, because the present kind of mentality that I think we're hearing out there, certainly I can tell you exists in the mining industry, is, well, yippee, the restrictions are off, and if it's there, we're going to go ahead and need to mine it. And that approach or that future certainly should be one that bothers all of us. And I think we need to listen to the people who are in a different position than we are as to maybe how we need to go about addressing this.
Next question is, if Dowa or Constantine were to dissolve either during the Palmer Project's active stage or after the lifespan of the mine has passed, who does the liability of potential acid mine drainage follow if the company becomes defunct?
Well, this is the problem with a company in this situation is Dow is an offshore company, would not have any assets in North America to address. Constantine, as a junior company, going bankrupt, they would simply have nothing. So this is why it's critical that we determine before the mine's permitted, and there's a requirement for adequate financial assurance before the mine's permitted. And I think I would just say right now, I work on financial assurance a lot. Probably one of the people who works on it the most globally. And the problem we get into is, even in the best of circumstance, we're calculating it for 100 years, and usually based upon what we assume are going to be pretty reasonable interest and inflation rates. And this stuff's actually going to go on for hundreds, thousands of years. We talk perpetuity, certainly beyond any imaginable time in many cases. And how we're really only addressing the first 100 years. And so there's, even when we talk financial assurance and the need to require that, we still need to look at how to do a better job of making sure that's something that future dependents, future generations long in the future, not just in the short term, can look to us having done the right thing and addressed it. And again, that's why we need to avoid any project we can that will result in that, as long as we still have options.
Any more questions out there? Chat, raise your hand.
Hopefully folks are getting exhausted.
It is later for you, isn't it, Jim?
That's okay.
Yeah, thanks for staying up late with us.
Yeah, so I guess if there's no more questions, we can wrap it up. Thanks again to all of you for joining us tonight, and especially to Jim Kuipers for sharing his lifetime of mining related expertise with us. We hope this information will be of use to our community and to our decision makers as we forge a path into the future, mindful of the potentially far-reaching and long-term impacts of our actions. Feel free to reach out to any of the organizations partnering on this event. We appreciate your feedback. Have a great night, everyone. Stay safe out there.
Bye all. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks so much.